Dead Man Walking. A 1993 nonfiction novel written by Sister Helen Prejean, cataloging her friendship with a death row inmate and their struggle against the death penalty. Dead Man Walking. A 1995 movie adaptation of the book starring Sean Penn with an Oscar-winning performance of Susan Sarandon for her portrayal of Sister Helen Prejean. Dead Man Walking. A phrase still used today by inmates. When a death row inmate walks down the run, other inmates will call out to one another, "There goes a dead man walking." We all know that Oklahoma has been in the media limelight here recently due to our execution process. And as an employee of the Department of Corrections, this is something that affects me. The negative publicity is something that affects me on a day-to-day basis. Oklahoma still has 48 people on death row, 47 men and 1 woman. Clayton Lockett was executed on April 29th of 2014. His would be the first in what would be a string of 3 botched executions in Oklahoma. The Oklahoman reported that the execution chamber was a bloody mess after his execution, due to the fact that the IV had been placed in his femoral artery. Also due to the fact that an incorrect needle size had been used. Charles Warner was executed on January 15th of 2015. His was the second execution that would be botched. The Oklahoman reported there that potassium acetate was used as opposed to potassium chloride, which is what the drug protocol calls for. And then there was Richard Glossop. His execution was originally scheduled for September 16th of 2015, but he was granted a 2-week stay by the Oklahoma Supreme Court. His execution was then rescheduled for September 30th of 2015. Susan Sarandon and Sister Helen Prejean then joined forces again to create a media frenzy over his scheduled execution. At the last minute, Governor Mary Fallin stepped in and called a halt to his execution as well. This time because the Oklahoma Department of Corrections reported that again it had received potassium acetate instead of potassium chloride from its drug company. Richard Glossop's execution was then scheduled again for November 6th of 2015. But prior to this date, Governor Mary Fallin stepped in and called a halt to all executions scheduled in Oklahoma, giving Oklahoma Department of Corrections an opportunity to get their stuff together, to figure out what had gone wrong, and to correct it. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections is a very policy-driven department. There's a policy and procedure for pretty much everything you can imagine, including the execution of offenders. OP 040301, entitled Execution of Offenders Sentenced to Death, basically walks you through the process. It's a step-by-step process cataloging different teams, different things that they're supposed to do, and time frames that those things are supposed to be done within. This policy sets forth a command team, which oversees the entire execution. An H-unit team, which is a special team that's in charge of getting the medication, storing the medication, and bringing the medication to the execution chamber when it's time. An intravenous IV team. It also sets forth a maintenance response team. They're in charge of making sure the equipment within the death chamber is working properly. It also sets forth a critical incident management team, a traffic control team, a witness team, and a victim services team. As you can see, the Department of Corrections has attempted to cover all of their bases. In this policy, there's also an attachment D, entitled Preparation and Administration of Chemicals. This attachment lists the chemicals that are used for the death penalty. It lays out the fact that the H-unit team is supposed to provide these chemicals to the IV team. The IV team is then responsible for taking the chemicals, for marking them, and by marking them I mean they ensure that the chemical names listed on there, the dose of the chemical, and then they also color code the chemicals as well. As you can see on the slide, the chemical midazolam is color coded as green, the chemical vercunium bromide is color coded as yellow, and potassium chloride is color coded as red. Each of these drugs are administered, and in between each one is a IV administration of heparin saline, which is color-coded as black. Now, there are different chemical combinations that can be used. There's 3 different chemical combinations that can be used, and ultimately the director of the Department of Corrections is the one that makes the decision on which chemical combination will be used at an execution. The one that is currently being utilized is the one with the midazolam, the zirconium bromide, and the potassium chloride. As I said, there's been 3 botched executions. And the Attorney General has stepped in at this point and called for a grand jury investigation. The grand jury investigation is currently ongoing. The Attorney General has stated in interviews that he expects it to be fair and firm, and he expects it to cover all executions in which there could have been a mistake, including previous ones such as Charles Warner's. The main focus of this grand jury investigation right now is to find out what's going on with the drug combinations, to find out why Oklahoma keeps receiving potassium acetate instead of potassium chloride. Everyone has been called in due to this grand jury investigation. Oklahoma State Penitentiary Warden Anita Trammell has been called in and interviewed. Director of the Department of Corrections, Robert Patton, has been called in and interviewed. Even DOC Legal Counsel David Zincata has been called before the grand jury and interviewed. As I said before, Governor Fallin has halted all executions, and as it stands right now, executions won't even be scheduled until 150 days from the conclusion of this grand jury investigation, and who knows how long that could take. In summary, Oklahoma has had 3 botched executions, and there's still an ongoing grand jury investigation. The long-term impact of what we're seeing is unknown. Will there be changes in DOC leadership? Of course there will. Already, the warden of OSP has stepped down. Anita Trammell has announced her retirement. Depending on the outcome of this, who knows what could happen to the director. Will there be DOC policy changes? Again, of course there will. After Clayton Lockett's execution, the Oklahoma Department of Corrections went in and completely revamped the policy for executions. After this grand jury returns, whatever its findings are, I'm sure again that policy will be changed and those findings will be incorporated. Will there be changes to the execution itself? Possibly. Will there be legislative changes? Again, possibly. Is this something that could overall affect changes within the death penalty? Is this something that could eventually be tried in the court of public opinion? Possibly. One thing that we do know is that what we're seeing, what we're watching right now, is history in the making.